Thanks for bringing me, Morton. This has been really, and thanks Adam for helping to put this together. It's been a really fun so far, and I've enjoyed the conversations I've had, and I look forward to talking more about these things. It's really interesting to learn about these struggles in other places and think about what's similar and what's different. So I'm going to give a talk today that I wrote for about Occupy and in general and Occupy Oakland in particular, and I gave it at a university in Los Angeles a couple of months ago, and I haven't really changed it that much for this particular context. So there may be some things that I wrote in here that I expected an American audience to recognize that you won't know the reference, and I'll try to explain those as I go along. But if I miss something like that, just feel free to ask me in the question and answer session. I'm also going to show some slides here of pictures from Occupy Oakland, and sometimes where I thought it was appropriate, there are little captions. The slides are not matched to the talk at all, so they're just going to be kind of flowing in the background. Hopefully they won't be too distracting and won't clash with what I'm saying, and maybe there will be unexpected surprises where the picture links up with what I'm saying. I haven't planned any of the timing, so I'm just gonna start running it, and hopefully it'll just go. So the question that I'm really trying to answer in this question is why Occupy happened and why it took the shape that it did. And in particular, I'm really interested in trying to figure out why the protest camp, the camp form and the plaza occupation form was so important over the last couple of years, and why it kind of spread around the world. What is it about this tactic that is connected to this particular moment in time, and why does it have this capacity to spread? What is the transmissibility of this tactic? So it's a question about why Occupy, in the particular sense of why Occupy Wall Street or the American context, but why are people camping out in plazas, and why is this the political form that struggles take today? So I'm asking not just about the tactical or strategic benefit of the outdoor occupation, but also about the entire causality of the Occupy phenomenon. Why did it arise at this particular moment and not some other moment, in this particular form and not some other form? Why did the occupations unfold in the way they did? Who took part and why? First off, the question of timing. In other words, why now? Or rather, to put it in more pointed terms, since the economic crisis has ushered in a newly volatile and riotous age, why did it take so long? Why did Occupy erupt in 2011 and not 2009 and 2010 when the crisis was already fully underway in the US? Did people reach some kind of breaking point as the economic crisis worsened month by month, as unemployment came to seem a permanent rather than transitional stage, as debts came to seem more and more unpayable, mortgages more and more burdensome? Notably, 2011 was the year in which the effects of the crisis were particularly devastating for governmental budgets, precipitating numerous opportunistic austerity programs, particularly at the state and municipal levels. And this is something I think that's very particular to the US context, which is that the federal government is not the site of the major austerity programs. They're often at the city level, at the state level, and so it's the kind of way that works ends up being very different than I think in other countries. But why then didn't Occupy emerge as an anti-austerity movement, as observers of events in Europe might have predicted? And this is actually what I thought it was going to be. Why did attempts to reproduce the Madison Capitol occupation of the spring fail so miserably? And I don't know if people will remember this, but there was a big occupation of a state capitol where they were trying to pass this anti-union law in Wisconsin, and I think people wanted to reproduce that in other American states and thought that it would spread. And that didn't happen. So the question is, why did that not work, but this other thing 6 months later come to take its place? Is it because of the weakness of the traditional actors in such movements, such as public sector unions, or the deep-seated anti-statism of Americans? It is certainly notable that unlike Greece or the UK, where the capital is also the largest city, capable of generating the largest protests, most major cuts in the US are undertaken by state rather than federal governments, meaning there is unlikely to be a single piece of legislation that will conjure forth a nationwide protest movement. I'm thinking like, in particular, student movement in Britain. As we know, Occupy imagines itself as a link in a global chain of protests which began in Tunisia, spread to Egypt, and from there to the cities of Spain, to Greece, and beyond. By the time it gets to Europe, this internationalism quite self-consciously imagines itself as propagated spontaneously through ineluctable processes of contagious, viral replication, sometimes attributed to the dispersive, horizontal character of social media. Now, in my view, spontaneous is simply the name we apply to those social manifestations whose causality we don't really understand. And if one looks closely at any of these instances, one sees groups reading the direction of the historical wind and attempting to direct the revolutionary mood toward concrete rebellion. There are always, in other words, specific acts of will within, if not behind, any spontaneous emergence, as we learn from the text messages the rioters of Britain sent to each other. And the original Occupy Wall Street call is no different. What distinguishes it from the earlier sequence is how long it took, how much delay there is between Syntagma Square and Zuccotti Park. So yes, why did it take so long? What is it that this delay measures? One answer might be that it measures the uncertainty here in the US, and it seems weird to say here now, about the target, the object, around which a protest movement might cohere. As we will see, this uncertainty turns out to be crucial to the course Occupy takes. So Occupy emerges in part from this new subterranean international of contagious and semi-spontaneous protest, of images and affects that circulate from place to place. The economic crisis is the conducting medium through which these transmissions pass. Its globalized and globalizing miseries are what allow for this process of transnational identification to be something other than ludicrous, so that the vast numbers of Egyptian and Tunisian college graduates, no longer assured a place in the state bureaucracies and the middle classes, find their corresponding numbers in the American degree holders, who likewise graduate with no employment prospects and mountains of debt. There is an actual rather than merely representational leveling at work here, and this is why the media determinists who ascribe causal power to Twitter or something like that get it wrong. If we take a step back from the specific properties of the technologies, we see that the extensive use of Twitter and Facebook in places like Egypt and Tunisia is one face of a more intensively and extensively integrated global economy, so that the increasing similarity of commodities and technologies and even cultural forms worldwide, a similarity which, as we know, is actually a mechanism for economic inequalization, makes it easier for these resonances to transmit, as it were. The representational leveling of the world spectacle piggybacks on the real leveling that is capitalist globalization. It is through the circuits of capitalist globalization that the economic crisis, which begins in some sense with the US banking, US housing market, and the related asset bubble, fans out into the world. And it is through these same circuits that the political consequences of the crisis, the protests, occupations, riots, return to the US. But inasmuch as Occupy and its antecedents emerge from the space of circulation, from this flow of images and feelings and ideas, as tactics, they are anti-circulational. They're tactics of staying put, of claiming space. To use a slightly more specialized language, they are territorializing tactics that emerge out of the deterritorialized drifts and flows of our cities. This is one of the things we'll want to answer about Occupy. Why is it that a so-called leaderless and decentralized movement, based upon the contagious proliferation of slogans, tactics, images, and practices, should require physical centralization in the central squares of our cities? In other words, why the camp? There's a certain intuitive intelligibility here. It makes sense that the relentless circles of global capitalism would find their opposite number in the classical geometry of the squares, that the relentless movement of the economy would precipitate a politics of refusing to move, of stopping, staying put, and as we'll see, blockading. One point that has not been made enough or made in the right way is that the camps respond to the evisceration of our cities, the enclosure, hyper-regulation, and homogenization of the life of the street, so that there is now little public space where people can encounter each other that is not mediated by commodities, by money. That is, just as Carolina was talking about not being able to just be in a square because there are no chairs or trees or any kind of space to be with each other. You need to go buy something somewhere if you want to encounter another person. There's no free space, and free in both senses of the word, meaning some space that you don't have to pay for, but also free in the sense of not being regulated by the law. That's what the next sentence says. If part of capitalism's development is to ensure that it remains the only human community possible, in other words, that all interactions between people are mediated by money and commodities, by the police and various state bureaucracies, or by technologies whose raison d'etre lies in the market and the workplace, then part of the appeal of the camps, I think, is that they promise, and I think it is just a promise, a form of community that is not automatically produced by economic transactions and predefined social categories. I think we should pause for a second and consider how remarkable it is for a generation of young people whose social life has been so entirely captured by social media, by screens in other words, to attempt to encounter each other face to face as they did. How remarkable it is that the first post-internet generation of young people, and I mean people who grew up using computers and Facebook and things like that from the time they were adolescents, should produce a politics that is all about dwelling together in common. Occupy focuses on the creation of community or communities because I think so many of the existing communities on which politics has relied have been dissolved, broken up, and reconstructed by capitalism in its own image. This is certainly the case for the working class as affirmative cultural form and identity, which not long ago had its own parties and unions, but also its own neighborhoods and meeting halls. It should be clear, however, that its disappearance as an identity or a cultural identity, which can be affirmed over and against the ruling order, does not at all mean for me the disappearance of class as instrument of social domination. Let's say people are still working class, but they don't have a working class identity. Therefore, although the camps were originally meant as the means to a political end, they quickly become the most compelling feature of the entire movement. And I think this may be the one thing that's different about the US than the other cases. I'm not really sure, and perhaps we can talk about that later. People forget about the trajectory which the original call for Occupy Wall Street sketched out, in which the occupiers would encamp and through a deliberative process discover their one demand, equivalent, one supposes, to a call for Mubarak's departure or a downvote on an austerity law. But there is no single demand to unite us all, as we discovered. Solidarity has to be produced, rather, through other mechanisms, through the camps and not just the assemblies, through the process of living together and not just speaking together. Some will know that Occupy draws its inspiration, in part, and I think probably not many people will know here, draws its inspiration in part from the wave of California university occupations in 2009, 2010, when significant debates about demands and demandlessness occurred, and in which key texts, like the communique from an absent future, argued for the impossibility of all demands and the impossibility of reformism, given the current nature of a dying capitalism. But this argument was an ideological position, something that had to be argued for. In the case of Occupy, this position, once the voice of the extreme ultra-left, the kind of thing that crazy people said, is simply the status quo. The debate had silently been won. Let's be clear, I'm not arguing that Occupy is a revolutionary movement aimed at the total transcendence of the capitalist system and the state, and unwilling to accept anything else. This is obviously not true. For the most part, Occupy has a reform-oriented horizon that is obvious to anyone. It is about class inequality in the US, about the distribution of wealth between the 99% and the 1%. Its implicit demand is fix this. make our society more equal. But this demand remains almost impossible to voice, since there is no concrete policy being recommended, and arguably little outside a revolutionary movement is likely to significantly impact equality in the US anytime soon. As such, any attempt to reduce this unspeakable demand to some concrete object, whether the Citizens United ruling or full employment, remains curiously too specific and too vague, likely to fragment the 99% into competing fractions. And I think we sort of heard Carolina articulate how that sort of process might work. In Citizens United, there's a Supreme Court ruling that said that corporations could spend as much money as they wanted in politics, and some people said that should be our one demand, repeal this law. And the law was passed in 2009, deep into the crisis, and it's just, it's as if these people thought that corporations didn't have control over politics before that law, which is crazy. They've always had control over politics, but it's this desire to find one thing, to find our Mubarak, the one demand that can unite us all, and in our case, it just doesn't exist. So, the camps are therefore a residue of the impossibility of demanding. Did I cycle through the whole thing? Okay, well, start over again. The camps are therefore a residue of the impossibility of demanding. It is not the demand that unites the camp, but a process of mutual aid and care. The very fact of trying to live together outside of the usual forms which make life possible, money, compelled labor, the police, produces solidarity, and the deliberative process of establishing consensus in the assemblies is only one part of this. Some will discuss such an emphasis on social reproduction and on living together in contemporary anarchist language of prefiguration. In other words, the camp prefigures the future non-capitalist society it strives toward. Its means are therefore equal to its ends. The camp becomes its own demand, as the saying goes, and this was a way that people would answer. They'd say, what is it that you want? What is your demand? And people would say, the camp is our demand, which I always thought was kind of a little silly, but I mean, it did articulate something. Now there's much to critique in this view. I do not think that the camps of Occupy Oakland really resemble, in any literal, structural, or even symbolic way, the kinds of social arrangements we might see during or after a revolutionary transformation of society. They are not really a vision of the future I want. But the camps do anticipate, in some regard, the kinds of questions, problems, and logistical challenges that a transformation might require. In other words, they allow people to experiment with solutions to problems for which capitalism has, for the most part, ready-made answers or no answers at all. There is therefore a certain negative prefiguration. It doesn't tell us what things are going to look like, but what they're not going to look like and what we don't know. Even if we might develop certain tactics and methods today that will be useful in a full-scale revolutionary transformation, for the most part, this is of an entirely different order. It's not going to scale up, like it's just going to be one big camp that covers the whole world, which is sort of silly. The real value is in making clear what the problems and challenges are and allowing people to actively experiment with solutions. The camps in this sense manifest how little we know how to do, how seemingly unprepared we are for the opportunity to reimagine social life. And by opening up a space where the answers are not pre-given, the camps call forth an incredible amount of practical ingenuity, oriented to a deep reconstruction of the relationship between work and social needs along the lines of free giving, and mostly everything in the camp was free. There was no money. People could take what they want. Transformation of the division of labor. People tried to do different kinds of things, and this wasn't always perfect. And in particular, its racial and gender component, that we can and should look at the way these categories obtained as far as who did what, in the sense that women were still maybe doing more of the cooking or more of tasks that are associated with women, and that's something that you would have to sort of try to reconstruct, or people would say, hey, we need to think about this. This is one of the greatest virtues of Occupy. In conditions of social need and open defiance, it seemed to endow each and every person with the license to organize something, anything, to come up with solutions to existing problems. as well as solutions to problems that don't exist, and this is something that happens a lot, to be a part of the processes and practices that matter. But as stories from all over the country attest, Occupy presented people with problems for which no satisfactory answers, much less utopian ones, were forthcoming. Without getting too deeply into the social composition of the camps, which I plan on talking about shortly, Occupy is striking as a space of encounter among people from incredibly different backgrounds. In particular, its success as a movement derives from the extent to which it solicited and encouraged the active involvement of people upon whom the economic crisis and capitalism in general has exacted the highest toll, newly homeless and long-term homeless peoples, who sometimes brought with them issues of mental illness, substance abuse, and trauma for which there were no adequate solutions, alongside the problems of racism, interpersonal violence, and sexual violence, which arose from all quarters, and the tensions and discords of a politicized, high-stress environment. I doubt there's a single large encampment that counts its response to these issues as successful, and some camps essentially decomposed because of their inability or unwillingness to address these problems, leading some to grimly speculate whether or not, if the police hadn't destroyed the camps, they wouldn't have eventually destroyed themselves. And I actually think that most of them probably would have come apart. To give you just one example of what I'm talking about, I'll tell you the story of S, and I've changed his name for legal reasons, who lived in Franco-Gawa Plaza, the park in front of City Hall, prior to Occupy Oakland's tenancy there, and who, as soon as the camp arrived, began diligently working in the kitchen, effectively helping to set it up. Whether because of the stress or something else, however, S becomes increasingly irascible and irritated, and one day he snaps, threatening other people with a kitchen knife. S then begins threatening people and getting into several fights a day. There is consensus among members of the camp about maintaining autonomy from the police and not involving them in disputes like this. That's to say, we didn't let the police come to the camp, we didn't work with the police, we didn't talk to them, we just told them to fuck off every time they came around. So, we weren't going to call them on this person. Attempts to mediate essentially fail, and he seems immune to reason. I mean, he keeps saying, hey, don't do that, and he keeps, threatening people with a knife, which isn't cool. So after fighting person after person, a group attempts to run him out of the camp. And he's a really big person. But S comes back. Finally, someone hits him over the head with a 2x4 and knocks him out. The medics follow him out of the camp and call an ambulance. 2 weeks later, he returns. He's entirely different and is now apparently taking some medication. He becomes a dedicated participant in the camp once again, and one day, after a police attack on the plaza, he is arrested for misdemeanor trespassing or obstruction, something very minor. The legal team is unable to secure his release, however, because of a probation violation. He is transferred to the county jail, where as usual, they refuse to give him his medicine, and they never give anybody their medicine in jail. They just let them suffer. What happens next is unclear, but he is alleged to have assaulted a prison guard. He is now facing a charge of felony assault on an officer, a potential third strike, and therefore a life sentence. And so I don't know if California has this 3 strikes law, which means that if you're convicted of 3 major crimes, you're automatically given a mandatory life sentence, which is horrible, right? So he's looking at, based on this small incident, a life sentence, and he's still in jail right now. There's now an entire subcommittee of Occupy Oakland devoted to supporting him and organizing his legal defense. This should give us some sense of the terrain. On one side, the brutal but perhaps unavoidable 2x4 to the head. On the other side, the even greater brutality of the state. No one would dare speak about this incident in the language of prefiguration. I mean, this is not an example of some beautiful, future world. This is an example of people trying and failing to deal with situations to the best of their ability. At the same time, the story confirms the essential correctness of Occupy Oakland's refusal to work with the police, who mean nothing less than a death sentence for S. In the argument I've been making, Occupy is not only or not just a protest movement. Rather, it is also about the dispossessed and disenfranchised developing new ways of meeting their needs, of taking care of each other, in a situation in which no one else will, in which there are no longer the jobs, nor the governmental provisions, nor even the monetary credit on which many of them might have relied in the past. This is the place to camp at the center of the narrative. But there is another position on Occupy, which describes the camp as a mere foundation for the creation of directly democratic agora, or spaces of encounter and appearance in the general assemblies. In this view, Occupy is really about political speech and discourse and the formation of a new hegemonic majority, the 99%, through consensus procedure. Its work involves incorporating the views and perspectives of the 99% in order to disclose the hypermajority that is already there, that is already present in our society. The defining phrase of the Occupy movement, "We are the 99%, is cleverly constructed so as to sit between a concept of a class, the poor against the rich, the 99% against the 1%, and a concept of the people. So it's something like a populist concept, and it's also something like a class struggle concept, and I think it sort of sits between these two in a really canny, but to me, problematic way. This 99% is supposed to mean almost everyone, next to whom the rich are a mere parasitic superfluity. The movement spreads through a logic of radical inclusivity. Effectively, however, We Are the 99% emerges, and this is mostly confirmed by a reading of the now famous and deeply affecting Tumblr blog, We Are the 99%. I don't know if people have seen this. People know what it is. So it was a blog on the internet, a Tumblr blog, and it just pictured people holding up signs and saying, you know, I have $20,000 in medical debts, I graduated from college 5 years ago, I can't find a job, I'm the 99%. And lots of these kinds of stories of the miseries that they experience in the crisis. But it's, you know, the point of this, if you look through it, it's actually a pretty narrow class segment. It's mostly people who are college educated, it's mostly people who might have expected once upon a time to be a part of the American middle class. Like, it's not really a portrait of the entire society. It's a you know, a particular segment of the society that's been hit very hard in the crisis. So it's, you know, the expression of a fairly distinct class formation. We might think of this class as the proletarianized middle class, where proletarian names the fact of being without reserves, without access to any property which one might use to survive. It names a condition of dispossession rather than exploitation. Homeowners who can't keep up with their payments or have lost their homes, university graduates saddled with student loan debt, which they can never hope to repay, people who have lost decent paying jobs and can't find anything else as good. The 99% are a class based on frustrated expectations, a class that feels itself dispossessed of certain rights and comforts, who expect, you know, to be given certain things, and they no longer have them. Because this class sits between some stratum of the already dispossessed, people who never had shit, and a world of relative privilege from which they have been excluded, it has a ready-to-hand claim to universality. Remember that the middle class, and maybe this is a particularly American way of looking at it, but in the US, everybody thinks they're middle class. That's the nature of it. Somehow, around the 1950s, the rich convinced everybody that they were middle class, and, you know, if you ask anybody, they'll say they're middle class. It's always somebody else who's poor, somebody else who's rich. So, you know, if you ask somebody who makes $30,000 a year what they are, they'll tell you they're middle class. If you talk to somebody who makes 5 times as much as that person, they're also middle class. And it's like the very rich who are rich, and, you know, then there's these other people who don't have anything. So it's always to me, the middle class is this, like, fundamentally narcissistic standpoint. The middle class is always what I am, as opposed to the two groups of people, the poor and the rich, who are not me. So it's always me, I'm the middle class, and then there's two forms of not me on either side. And that's the psychology of the middle class. This is why someone who is trying to support I already told you that. So it is thus that, even though the 99%, strictly speaking, represents or claims to represent almost everybody, the concept is the expression of a particular group of somebodies, a group of somebodies who think they are everybody's, a group which forms an essential part of the Occupy phenomenon, and indeed, seen globally, is at the center of the uprisings worldwide, which increasingly feature young, college-educated people whose life chances have been savaged by the economic crisis. The great virtue of Occupy and the source of its power lies in the fact that the camps force an encounter between this group, the proletarianized middle class, the 99%, and the ever-growing number of homeless, whose twin destitutions might come to seem common aspects, more severe and less severe, of a shared proletarian condition. I do not want to make it seem as if these two tendencies, these two perspectives, are mutually exclusive. Both camp and assembly depend on each other in the current conjuncture. But the question is one of emphasis. Are we the 99%, or are we the proletariat? Is this a movement of dispossessed and disenfranchised people taking care of each other and finding ways to survive in conditions of social breakdown? Or is it an attempt to alter the national discourse and opinion? Is it about demanding or claiming, political rights or social needs? So it's an encounter between this middle-class group and people like S, who I was telling you about, who had been sleeping in that park, which we, when occupied, he'd been sleeping there for who knows how long, months, years. So in a certain sense, it should not surprise that Occupy is so oriented toward the plane of public opinion and public perception. As I noted above, Occupy emerges out of the flow of images of revolt and languages of revolt that cross our screens. These images, traveling through the conducting medium of shared misery, bear a certain effective charge, a certain exhilaration, the exhilaration perhaps of having crossed the barrier of fear, as one says of the protesters of the Middle East, or as they say of themselves. They're catalysts. At a basic level, they say, yes, this is possible. You too can do this. The consequence, however, is that some large faction within Occupy comes to believe that its destiny lies within this flow of images. In other words, the point of Occupy is to become visible, to appear, to communicate to other potentially like-minded people, to change opinion through the becoming apparent of the 99%. It is in this sense that the occupations are manifestations or demonstrations, following the logic of exhibition and publicity. They are in this way a giant protest sign or banner which reads, "We are the 99%. It is because of this logic of display that an entire Occupy ideology develops around Twitter messages and live-streamed video, not only imagining these technologies endowed with supernatural capacity to mobilize and arouse, but more importantly, imagining them as a politics in and of themselves. The occupation becomes not an occupation through Twitter, but of Twitter. Not Occupy Wall Street, but #OWS. The contagious spread of occupations, manifestations, strikes, and riots across the globe and across the US is somehow made simply equivalent with the viral proliferation of the internet meme or the Twitter hoax. And there's some material I cut out here which talks about how, in many ways, Occupy was preceded both by the WikiLeaks phenomenon and the interventions of Anonymous, and that this somehow seemed to be a kind of precursor in the digital sphere of what happened in the real world, and kind of set some of the ideological coordinates for for the manifestation. And you would see people with Guy Fawkes masks, and they had a particular idea about the world that was in many ways really informed by Anonymous and WikiLeaks, and this idea that as I take Assange's philosophy of the world to be, there's this idea that if everybody just knows what's happening, if you just share the right information, people will change their views. I think this is a really naive idea, and I actually think that these revelations about what the U.S. State Department did had zero effect, because they told us what we already knew already. And it's just, but it's this idea that if I just make transparent or visible to the rest of the world what's happening here, it's going to produce this change. And I don't know that I actually agree with that, but I think that idea was really a big part of what happened, and it's an important component of the whole thing. So one of the reasons why the Occupy camps are so easily referred to the churn of language and image in old and new media is that their object, their enemy and target, is so supremely abstract. There is no single tyrant to cast out as in Egypt, much less a regime. There is no single piece of legislation to deflect as with UK and Greece. Even if, as seems fairly accurate, at least as far as Occupy's initial manifestations go, one defines the target narrowly as the finance sector and the grievance as inequality. These are particularly ethereal objectives. the finance sector is abstract by definition. The operations of a bank, which concern money rather than things for the most part, are not really in any particular place, but rather pass through these places as distributed flows of information, paperwork, and people. Shutting down a bank or even the stock exchange itself, which Occupy wanted to do at one point, or still wants to, but can't, is therefore symbolic because, as you know, the New York Police Department is the 6th largest standing army in the world. So Occupy Wall Street has a particular problem with that. Shutting down a bank or even the stock exchange itself is therefore symbolic in a way that shutting down a factory is not. One can try and find the offices where crucial operational functions can be found, but even then, these office complexes are likely to be one among many, distributed throughout cities, throughout the country and the world. So the banks exist in that same communicational interspace to which Occupy is often referred. There are a couple of important consequences of these different dynamics that I want to touch on before concluding. One is that an orientation towards political speech and political image, toward the formation of the 99% around particular ideological stances, ends up emphasizing a logic of victimization that has been absolutely essential to the growth of Occupy, but at a certain point became a rather severe limit. As anyone knows, Occupy's most explosive growth in places like New York and Oakland alike came as a response to police repression. Whether we think of the initial pepper spraying of women at an OWS march early on that so shocked people and swelled its ranks at a moment when it seemed unclear if it had any momentum, or the near murder of Scott Olson by the Oakland Police Department after the raid on Occupy Oakland's camp. Police repression has been, for a long time, the motor of Occupy's developments, provoking outrage and bringing greater and greater numbers into the streets. And so almost every time that the movement swelled, it was because there was some image of people being brutalized by the police. But at the same time, such responses usually depend upon a notion of infringed rights and implicitly a distinction between good and bad protesters. Therefore, cynically or not, they end up becoming a mechanism of self-policing, convincing people that they need to behave a certain way for the cameras in order to count on certain support. The goal of getting favorable press by an entirely hostile news industry thus becomes an apparatus of self-regulation. So you sort of perform for the cameras and you behave a certain way and you do the work of regulating your own behavior. There was always something profoundly tautological about these arguments. When asked why they oppose a certain tactic, say smashing a bank's window, for the most part, people will tell you that they don't actually care about the window or the bank, and they don't actually think it's morally wrong. But they oppose it because other people oppose it, and therefore it causes the movement to lose support. The problem, however, is that when you go ask that other person who they think oppose it, they also tell you that they oppose it because someone else opposes it. And you can't actually find anybody who thinks it's wrong for its own sake. So you wonder why somebody just doesn't make an argument for doing this thing instead of always pretending that there's some other person out there who really doesn't like it. So everyone remains spellbound, so for those of you who, everyone remains spellbound by collectively hallucinated public opinion. And I, for the most part, think that public opinion doesn't really exist. It's what Lacan calls the big other. It's just this kind of like made up thing that exists out there, and it's a mirage. This is why when journalists do polls, you can get the people to believe in any number of horrible things, great things, just depending on how you ask the question. It's just they're always shifting what people think. This other directedness is one of the problems with the ideology of struggle on the ideological plane, this idea that you're trying to bring more people into the movement to form a shared opinion. And it's also therefore one of the consequences of the 99% class standpoint. But the camp and the assembly emerge, gain tactical supremacy, and become ends in and of themselves because of the essential abstractness of the enemy and the difficulty of demanding anything concrete from such an enemy. These are both strategies of dealing with this problem, whether it's the assembly-oriented one or the camp-oriented one. Confronted with the impasse of the present, the camps instead orient themselves toward the project of mutual aid and care, and the assemblies toward the integration of new members and viewpoints, precisely because it is unclear where the enemy is exactly, or how one would go about attacking this enemy or impacting its ability to make us miserable. Though some see in the assemblies the seed form for reorganization of society along directly democratic lines, see them as the Greek agora, in other words, and others see in the camps not only a political reorganization, but a social and economic reorganization according to principles of free giving, voluntary labor, and rotations of tasks. In other words, see in it a commune. The vast wealth of our society still remains over there, held under the ownership and political control of the so-called 1%, and quite clearly inaccessible by the dispossessed who camp in the public squares and parks. We're camping in the parks and eating beans, it's not, again, this isn't utopian. The space of the public the camps create is therefore also the space of the outside. This is a project that takes place quite literally out in the cold. The danger in this regard is that the self-organization of the dispossessed in the camps becomes instead the self-organization of dispossession, the reproduction of dispossession, rather than a step on the way to its overcoming. The protest camps are unsettlingly close to other kinds of camps, refugee camps, for instance, or the depoliticized encampments of homeless people that have sprung up across the country in the last few years, fenced in, patrolled by private security guards, visited from time to time by charities and public workers. In some cities, this is essentially what the camps became. Unwilling or unable to confront the challenges the camps raised, the middle-class activists of the 99% essentially stopped attending, leaving the largely homeless campers to defend for themselves until the eventual police raid. I hope that it's become clear that I don't find either of these two paths described so far, the path of the camp or the path of the assembly, satisfactory. The assembly's risk of formalism and proceduralism that is also ephemeral, detached from people's real needs, blind to the fact of the very limited control they offer. On the other hand, the camp, as an end in itself, depends upon the fantasy of creating communism in one park. Even leaving aside for a moment the fact that the camps depended on money, on commodities produced in the surrounding capitalist world, and by extension on the employment of some occupiers, meaning that they were dependent upon the economy which they opposed, it is clear that the camps featured contradictions which were insoluble as such. There was no way for the camps to persevere and fix the problems they encountered, at least not without a radical transformation of the grounds on which they were constructed. Therefore, even if I side strategically with the party which views the camp and the possibilities for proletarian self-organization which the camp allowed as Occupy's most significant achievement, there can be little doubt about the firm limits these acts of self-organization encountered. And I do think that in many cases, if the police hadn't evicted the camps, a lot of them would have just kind of collapsed through these internal contradictions. There were places where I saw some of those beautiful things I'd ever experienced, and they were sort of incredible, and they were also like hell sometimes. There is, however, an alternate strategic avenue here, one where the Occupy camps and assemblies focus on offensive strategy rather than self-reproduction or the cultivation of a particular ideological hegemony. But as I noted above, the entities which Occupy opposes are overwhelmingly abstract, against which most tactics will seem too specific, too targeted, and narrow. Furthermore, the class composition of the movement makes certain workplace-based offensive strategies difficult to pursue. How then does a movement composed, in large measure, of the jobless and homeless, the underemployed and contingently employed, a movement of people who, when they work, do so in difficult to organize service sector jobs, render these very abstract enemies tangible? In other words, where and how do people strike out when action at the site of production, as workers, is largely impossible for them? As we've seen, one answer is that they don't strike out at all. And instead of focusing on elusive and abstract enemies, they either turn inward, building their own capacities and taking care of their own people, or turn outward in a lateral appeal to other potential sympathizers. And yet, this is not really a viable solution at all, since antagonism, whether it's antagonism toward the banks, the police, the 99%, is what guarantees the fragile unity of the camps and the assemblies. The autonomy of the camps is only really possible when asserted against something, against some common enemy, some resistant force. In the absence of open confrontation, the various factions and groups within Occupy turn on each other. Moreover, the camps and assemblies can't just be defined idly against the status quo. They have to imagine themselves as expanding, growing, becoming more powerful in measurable ways, lest people lose interest and drift away. And this is the sense in which it becomes possible to speak of Occupy as a movement or a social movement. A movement is a social force whose powers in the present depend upon the projection of a possible future, whether of revolution or reform. Without such a projection, many people won't get involved. I mean, unless they think it's going to make their life better in some way or there's going to lead to some different future. Therefore, if they were communes, in the sense that Occupy Oakland referred to itself as the Oakland Commune, they were communes on this projectual basis. They were communes by virtue of their antagonism to the condition which produced them and their desire to abolish those conditions. For the reasons discussed above, the abstractness of the enemies, the class composition of the participants, Occupy's offensive struggles tend towards certain characteristics. For one, inasmuch as Occupy takes place outside, it also has to attack from the outside. If it aims to interrupt capitalist production, it does so by and large from the side of capitalist circulation, from outside the workplace, by blockading its doors or interrupting the circulation of bodies and goods in the surrounding streets. Secondly, the struggles tend toward a certain generality. That is, if they are interventions in the sphere of circulation, they tend to fight not against particular forms of circulation, the trucks of this business or that business, or this bank or that bank, but against circulation in general. This is because rather than domination by particular capitals, by particular bosses or employers, the unemployed experience domination as domination by capital in general, by the total capitalist system, which forces them to rely upon money and the unrealizable sale of their labor power. It is not, therefore, the case that these struggles and interventions are mere abstractions that need to be grounded in concrete targets and demands, but rather that abstraction is for them what is concrete. Circulation is the space where this concrete abstraction can be grasped. The shift toward the sphere of circulation is not new to Occupy. In fact, over the last few decades, the eruption of struggles in the space of circulation has increased as the number of struggles in the sphere of production has decreased. This is because the technological restructuring of the workplace that has taken place since the 1980s or 1970s, rendering more and more workers redundant, has occurred alongside an equally momentous technological reorganization of the supply chain. As opportunities to rationalize production have disappeared, more and more emphasis has fallen on automating, informationalizing, and speeding up the transport and sale of goods. This is referred to as the logistics revolution. As a result, manufacturers, distributors, and retailers avoid the cost of warehousing goods through ever more precise coordination of shipments. In such a situation, without stocks on hand or warehouse goods, delays of up to a few hours can cause major disruptions in the supply chain. Given this restructuring of the relationship between circulation and production, and given the class composition of the Occupy movement, it should come as no surprise that when Occupy Oakland went on the offensive, calling for a general strike in response to the police attack on their camp, such a strike was conducted largely through blockades of the flows of capital, the Oakland ports in particular, rather than through a collective withdrawal of their labor from whole workplaces. In the case of the participants who did have jobs, they skipped work that day in order to participate in the strike, but largely through individualistic methods, calling in sick, for instance. The events on November 2nd in Oakland, as examples of a post-industrial general strike, confirm a tendency that one can read as far back as the Argentinian piqueteros of the late 1990s and early 2000s, where blockades of roads and other sites of distribution were tactics specifically described as the métier of the unemployed and contingently employed. And again, during the protests and general strikes of 2010 in France, which emerged in response to proposed changes in French pension law, these piquets volants established a sort of tactical supremacy. The French case showed again that decentralized, roving blockades could effectively paralyze entire cities, either by supporting strikes at certain key workplaces, the refineries in particular, or engaging in their own autonomous interruptions of important supply points, bridges, and thoroughfares. Currently, it's almost last paragraph. Currently, Occupy is in a period of hibernation and perhaps decline, waiting for the arrival of spring and perhaps a hot summer. The eviction of the camps has left the entire movement somewhat disoriented, since the camp was, as I have demonstrated, the central feature of its political logic. Currently, the General Assemblies in the US have endorsed the general strike for May 1st, based in part around Oakland's experience on November 2nd. Many hope that May Day will bring a revitalization of Occupy and even perhaps a reestablishment of the camps now that the weather has warmed up. Whatever happens, it's clear that this strike will conform to the general characteristics described so far, and already the plans emerging from the various cities seem to revolve around blockading key bridges, tunnels, and thoroughfares, as well as shutting down mass transit systems. As I said, this attack on circulation as such is what makes the strike a general strike. But this is not completely right. This generality finds its dialectical counterpart in new forms of specificity and local, particularized struggles, some with particular demands, which are always happening anyway. In particular, many in the US are at present trying to follow in the footsteps of the 15M movement by transforming the General Assemblies into coordinated neighborhood assemblies and other types of particular assemblies of service workers or sex workers, to give a couple of examples, which can become the base for new forms of self-organization and struggle tailored to the particular needs of particular situations. At the same time, it seems clear that the turn toward the particular runs the risk of diffusing and dispersing the energies aroused by the plaza occupations, driving such energies away into 1,000 small and ultimately insignificant struggles. The general perspective has to be maintained one way or another, and not through the establishment of some kind of overarching body or coordinating council, as some would advocate, but through lateral linkages between individual bodies. In a certain sense, this means nothing more than good communication. In any case, it's clear to me from recent examples, the Spanish general strike, for instance, that one needs both the centripetal and centrifugal forces. Needs forces going out and coming in, centralizing and decentralizing. In offering this perspective, I'm inclined to close with a quote by Rosa Luxemburg, written almost a century ago, from her famous essay, or over a century ago, on the general strike, where she perfectly describes the relationship between the general and the specific, which I have been describing, so I'll just read it and that'll be it. The mass strike, as the Russian Revolution shows it to us, is such a changeable phenomenon that it reflects all the phases of the political and economic struggle, all stages and factors of the revolution. Its adaptability, its efficiency, the factors of its origin are constantly changing. It suddenly opens new and wide perspectives of the revolution when it appears to have already arrived in a narrow pass and where it is impossible for anyone to reckon upon it with any degree of certainty. It flows now like a broad billow over the whole kingdom, and now divides into a gigantic network of narrow streams. Now it bubbles forth from under the ground like a fresh spring, and now is completely lost under the earth. Political and economic strikes, mass strikes and partial strikes, demonstrative strikes and fighting strikes, general strikes of individual branches of industry and general strikes in individual towns, peaceful wage struggles and street massacres, barricade fighting, all these run together through one another, run side by side, cross one another, flow in and over one another. It is a ceaselessly moving, changing sea of phenomena. And the law of motion of these phenomena is clear. It does not lie in the mass strike itself, nor in its technical details, but in the political and social proportions of the forces